Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm finally going to be explaining this chart, this one right here, in full, our monitor response time performance charts that you will have seen in many of our reviews. The current iteration has been in use since the start of 2021 and it's absolutely packed with information. So if you want to learn what everything is on this chart, what the numbers mean, how we measure them, what is response time, what is overshoot, what is cumulative deviation, you've come to the right place. This video isn't going to be for everyone, but if you are interested in monitor performance and how things work, you'll hopefully learn a ton from this video. So I'd encourage using the chapter markers below to skip to anything you want to learn about. Not sure how long this will take, but here goes. Over to you, VoiceOver Tim. I know you're equipped with a nice whiteboard for this one. Hello everyone, VoiceOver Tim here. It's good to be here to discuss our response time charts finally and really dive deep into all of the numbers that you're seeing on the screen here. For this video, I'm going to be using primarily this chart as an example. It's from our Gigabyte M27QP review. This chart is run at 144 Hz with the balanced overdrive setting, but that stuff doesn't really matter too much. What we're mostly interested in are all the numbers here and properly explaining things like response times, overshoot, and cumulative deviation. So just a quick look at this chart first up before we dive into some of the things more in depth. Obviously, on the left-hand side here, we have response time numbers. So these numbers below here are relating to this header of response times. In the center section, this center heat map is relating to the overshoot values. And then on the right hand side, we have our cumulative deviation values. And combined, the response time numbers, the peak overshoot numbers, and the cumulative deviation numbers give us most of what we need to really dive into the response time performance of a monitor. Below these heat map charts are our summaries. So we have our summary of average response performance here. We have our total response time performance, which we'll talk about in depth here. We also have our summary of inverse ghosting and our cumulative deviation numbers. So all of these numbers combined get averaged into a lot of these different things that you'll see below here, but we'll talk about all of that stuff in detail as we go along. The first thing that I want to talk about are these response time numbers. So the stuff that you see here below this chart and in this heat map chart, let's call them heat maps. I think that's a good name for it. So we're going to first talk about response times. What are response times? How are they calculated? How we calculate them? And for that, we're going to need a slightly different diagram to explain everything. So let's flick over to that now. So what we're looking at now is the bare bones of a response time plot that we'll be filling out with all the data that you need to understand how we measure response times. Of course, though, there are a few things that need to be labeled first up, so let's go about doing that. On this axis, the x-axis, we have got time. So as we move from left to right, we're increasing our time value. And then on the y-axis, we have got the light output level. So our sensor is, of course, light sensitive, and it produces a voltage for the various different light levels that it's measuring. And a high voltage means a higher light output level. So what you'd normally see from the sensor output is something like 0 volts down here for the full black image that we're showing here in this purple line. And then you'd have something like 10 volts up here, which would show the final light output level for full white in this particular example. However, the way that we actually measure response times is through a process called gamma calibration. So that means that we're changing these y-axis values from the linear light output to the gamma calibrated RGB values. So let's go put that in. So this means our y-axis is the RGB values. This would be RGB 0 for full black, and this would be RGB 255 for an 8-bit sort of black to white representation. So the reason why we use gamma calibration is fully explained in our response time video from the start of 2021 on the main Hardware Unboxed channel, where we go through why we shifted to this method, as we do feel it's more accurate. It more accurately represents what your eyes will be seeing. Don't want to go through all of that again in this video, otherwise it'll be super long. But basically on the y-axis, we've got RGB values. How the monitor actually transitions, let's put that in here. So most of them look something like this. So I'm just freehanding it here. So not a perfect representation, but I think that's a fairly typical response time that we're looking at. Now, when most people think about how would you measure a response time, the general thinking is that you would go and start measuring from the very moment that the transition starts to occur, which is right about there, to the very final value once it's finally reached its steady state long-term high value. And the reason why we don't do this is firstly that the sensor does have some noise, so we want to exclude that from any of the final measurements. And also measuring this sort of very slow final part of the transition isn't really that relevant and isn't going to be that noticeable for what you actually see on the screen. So it's important to have a tolerance for when we start and finish measuring so that we're not really capturing the noise and we're not capturing these sorts of irrelevant parts on the chart. So let's put in our tolerances now. So here we've got our tolerances in place. And what this means is that we start measuring once the transition has reached 3% of its total final value. And then we stop measuring 3% before the final value. So 3% tolerances at either end. Then we put these measurements in, and this distance from here to here becomes our response time. So let's just put that in there. That is our response times. So again, this is the summarized timeline of how we measure response times. Our response time measurement tool, our photo detector, produces this purple graph that encompasses the entirety of the monitor's response time. We then change the light output values to RGB values, thus gamma calibrating the display. We then begin our measurement once the transition has reached 3% of its total final value, and we stop measuring once it's reached 3% below the final value. This is the case even if there's some overshoot with the transition that's being measured. So let's say we have a transition that looks slightly different, it's a bit faster, but it has some overshoot that looks something like this. We still produce the measurements at the exact same points, which means that to measure the response time, we would take our final measurement point that we've got here, we would shift it to the point where it crosses that 3% tolerance value right about there. We would measure the response time as being this difference here, which is obviously a lot shorter than the previous transition, but that still gives us that initial response time value that you see in our charts. So once we've measured our response times using the method that we've described previously, they go into these heat map charts on this left-hand side. So previously we measured the 0 to 255 transition, full black to full white. So we've got that listed in the chart here. So we used the rise time, so we're looking at this particular value here. In other words, we went from 0 to 255. So that's this particular transition there. And for this monitor, we got a response time of 5.16 milliseconds using the methodology that we just described. However, as you can see, there are lots of different transitions that we're measuring. We're not just going 0 to 255 every single time, we're going 0 to 102, we're going 77 to 153. And basically what that means, going back to our previous chart, is that instead of these particular numbers here being, say, 0 and 255, there may be something different, like, say, 77 to 153. But the measurements that we're taking in terms of how we're going about the measurement process, that is the same for all of the transitions that we look at. So with this 77 to 153 example, you'll see here that we're going from 77. So we look down the from column here to find 77. We then move across the 2 line until we find 153, which is right there. So this is really how to read these monitor response time heat maps. We've got our from values in this y-axis here. So these are the starting values that we're measuring from, and then our 2 values in the x-axis, and you can just correlate those 2 points onto any transition that you want. So for example, if we were looking at going from 102 to 203, we look at from 102, we just go across to 203, and we'll find that that right there, 3.47 milliseconds, was the 102 to 203 RGB value transition for this particular monitor. Of course, we're not just looking at rise times in these particular heat map charts, rise times being when a value is going from a lower value to a higher value. We also get fall times going from a higher value to a lower value. So for example, if we're going from 128 to 77, so from 128 to 77, you'll see that that number's there in the chart as well, 4.69 milliseconds for this particular display. And that continues to be the case for basically all the transitions that we want to be measuring. So for every monitor that we review, we take 110 transition samples going from 0 to 255 and 0 to 255 in both the from and to directions. And that just gives us a really nice look at various different areas to performance. We've got large transitions like 0 to 255, but we've also got small transitions like 0 to 51. And of course, the same for fall times as well. And that just gives us all sorts of different examples of how the monitor performs. Also important to note here is that all of these transitions that you'll see here, these are not from single runs. These are actually from an average of 10 runs per number that you see. So for example, if we're looking at, say, the 51 to 128 transitions, that's right there. We've got 3.58 milliseconds. That's an average of doing the previous process that we described 10 times, getting those numbers, averaging them together. And that minimizes some of the run-to-run variance that you may see and just really strengthens the data that we're getting. So once we've got all of these numbers in this chart for response times, and we're looking at, of course, the time the display takes to transition between colors, we can then produce some average values. So below the chart here, obviously the primary one that we talk about is the average response time. So what this is all of these values, all 110 values up there, averaged into a single value. That one should be fairly easy to understand. The average rise and average fall are also fairly straightforward. The average rise is for every transition that goes from a lower value to a higher value. So if you look at the chart, that is the upper right-hand triangle of this particular chart. Done not a great job of drawing that, but basically all of these transitions up here start from a lower value and finish at a higher light output value, their rise times, and they get averaged into this particular value there. Opposite process for the average fall times. These transitions in this lower left-hand triangle, those are all the values that start at a higher value and finish at a lower value. Those are fall times, and those get averaged into that value there. The best and worst transitions, hopefully those will be fairly straightforward as well. The best transition is the fastest transition. For this monitor, 1.99 milliseconds, which would have been that transition there. And then for the worst transition, 10.69 milliseconds, that would be that transition there. As for the average dark level, which is seen here, this is relevant for VA monitors, and it encompasses all the transitions up to about 40% gray, which is 0 to 102 on the response time chart. So all of these numbers that you see here, those get averaged into this particular value there. And that tells us the performance for moving around dark shades of gray. And again, once we see things like dark level smearing for VA monitors, where those dark transitions really do take a long time and they smear across the screen, the dark level average gives us just a nice summary of how that performance is affecting VA displays. The other thing that's of course relevant is the color coding that you'll see on the screen here. Green transitions are the fastest transitions, the ideal transitions that we're looking for. So things like, say, this 1.99 millisecond transition is very green. And then this cycles all the way through to orange transitions. And sometimes for the slowest monitors, we start to see red transitions as well, which indicate that the response times really are too slow. And we've just set this color coding scheme to be relative to what we think are sort of the fastest and slowest transitions that we think are acceptable. So often around that 2 to 3 millisecond range is where you'll see a lot of strong greens. Generally speaking, monitors that hit 2 to 3 milliseconds are very clear. Monitors that are more around 10 milliseconds or 15 milliseconds are very slow. So those get red coloring, and that's when you'll see a lot of ghosting and smearing. The next thing to talk about is overshoot, the middle section of the chart that you'll see here. So this particular heat map, those are the overshoot values. So let's look at what overshoot is. So here was our initial response curve example, and as you'll see here, there's no overshoot to speak of, and that's because at no point does this transition ever exceed the final steady state value. So when transitions don't exceed this final value, there's no overshoot, there's no going above that final value, no overshooting that final value. However, with monitors, there are plenty of examples where the transition does exceed the final value before settling down to that value over a period of time. So one example of that may be something that looks like this, a transition that's very fast, but overshoots that final value before settling back down, something that looks a little bit like that. So this transition in orange clearly is overshooting the final value because it's exceeding this long-term steady state value that we're actually after for the particular transition. So how do we measure overshoot? Well, let's put some numbers to this particular example to better illustrate how overshoot is calculated. Let's say that our initial value for this transition was RGB value 0, so full black, and let's say we're going to about RGB value 100, so that's in the mid-gray range. However, this transition in particular overshoots to RGB value 120. So we can see that that's clearly higher than RGB value 100, and we're interested in measuring sort of this distance here, from here to here, from the steady state value to the top overshoot value. And we do that via a simple percentage. For this particular transition, we can see that we've got a peak overshoot value in the RGB x-axis of 120, and our final steady state value is 100. So what we end up getting when we divide these is 1.2, and we just simply convert that to a percentage, which would be 20%. So it's a very simple calculation process. We're just looking at the percentage that the transition exceeds that final steady state value, and we're putting those into the charts. The calculation that you saw previously is then done for all 110 transitions, which you'll see in this middle heat map here. The previous example we did was 0 to 100. We just used very simple numbers. It's very close to, say, the 0 to 102 transition, which in this case would be this very transition here, about 22.8% for the M27QP running at 144 Hertz. But again, this is calculated for every single transition here, and it's not just for the risers. Again, like we saw earlier, it is possible for transitions to undershoot, which would become these sorts of lower triangular sections here when we're starting from a high value, finishing at a low value. And you'll often see that the transitions look something like that, where we're measuring this distance here, which then becomes the undershoot value, and those all go into these charts as well. So again, it's written on the chart there how much the response exceeds the target value by in a percentage, and you'll see that for every single transition measured here. Very simple averages are then used. We've got the average error rate, which you'll see below the chart here. That's the average of all 110 values in that heat map chart. You'll also see the worst error. That's very simply the worst number, which again for this monitor is 71%. However, the primary metric we use for describing overshoot is something called the inverse ghosting rate, which you'll see in the charts here. So let's explain that. For a lot of transitions, you will see a very small amount of overshoot that isn't very relevant. Like, let's say we've got a transition that looks something like this, where there's a very small amount of overshoot here that isn't very relevant for the final image. However, for transitions where we're seeing a lot of overshoot, stuff like this part is going to be very noticeable to your eyes when you're doing things that are in fast motion. So there's kind of a threshold that you'll see from looking at a lot of monitors, looking at the overshoot levels and the final image quality. There's kind of a threshold where once the overshoot is exceeding that level, it tends to be fairly noticeable. And what we've found just over quite a lot of time, experimenting with monitors, testing monitors, is that a threshold of 15% in terms of the overshoot value tends to be where you'll start to notice the overshoot on screen. You'll start to see those inverse ghosting artifacts that we've talked about in a lot of our reviews. So what the inverse ghosting rate is let's have a look at all of the transitions, all 110 transitions in the heat map chart, and find the transitions where the overshoot level exceeds 15%. And you'll see for this monitor, there's a lot of them, like here and here and here, and these ones here, there's a few here, a lot of these, but we're not going to include the ones like this, the ones that are below 15%, because these values, they're not going to be particularly noticeable. So with the inverse ghosting rate, what we're looking at is what percentage of transitions that we've measured exceed this 15% tolerance value. So for this particular monitor, the M27QP at 144 Hertz, 31.8% of the transitions in this chart exceed 15%, and that gives us our inverse ghosting rate. Typically for monitors, what we see is anywhere between 20 and 30% inverse ghosting rate is where you'll start to see noticeable inverse ghosting on the screen. If a monitor only has, say, 10 or 15% of its transitions showing this noticeable level of inverse ghosting, you tend not to be able to notice it. But things over 30%, say you've got a 40 or 50% inverse ghosting rate, that's typically when we'll see a lot of inverse ghosting on the screen, and that's when we'll show that inverse ghosting rate percentage with a nice red color behind it so that you know it's not a very good result. What I'll also talk about now are these values right here, the average total response time values. So these are related to the initial response time values that you see in this heat map here, but they're calculated in a slightly different way. So let's go back to our response time example and have a look at how we go about it. So here we've got our response time example, both with and without overshoot, with overshoot in the orange and without overshoot in the purple. So for our main response time metric, we stop measuring the response time once the transition crosses the threshold for the first time. So for our measurement with lots of overshoot, we're stopping the measurement there. And for our transition with not very much overshoot, we're stopping our measurement there. But as you can see, the overshoot transition continues to effectively transition for an additional period of time. So with our total response time measurements, we include the time it takes for the overshoot to occur. So for this particular orange transition, instead of stopping our measurement there, we're stopping our measurement roughly here, which encompasses the time that the overshoot takes to occur. This has the benefit of telling us how long it takes to get from one steady state value, so this low value here, to the final steady state value. Previously, we were sort of measuring this halfway point, the first time that the transition eventually hits that tolerance threshold. For the total response time, we're measuring all the way up to this final steady state value. However, the total response time still features a tolerance value so that we avoid things like sensor noise. And in this situation, we're using a 1% tolerance at either end. So what this means is that we start measuring once the transition reaches 1% of its final value, and we stop measuring once it reaches 1% above or below its final value. However, as we've just been talking about, we are measuring beyond the point which the initial transition takes place. We're measuring all the way to the end of the overshoot value, which means we need effectively two tolerances, one above and one below the transition. So that looks something like this, where we have a 1% tolerance value above and a 1% tolerance value below the steady state value. For transitions with no overshoot, so the purple line, we measure until the transition gets within 1% of the final steady state value. And for transitions with overshoot, we continue to measure along the curve beyond the point where overshoot occurs, up until the point where again we get within 1% of the steady state value. So for that would be there. We then do this for all 110 transitions, similar to this response time chart here. We just don't show the heat map for the total response time. We then average all those values, so all 110 values get averaged into the total response time figure that you'll see here, along with the rise and fall metrics, which again are very similar to the rise and fall metrics over here, just calculated in the way that we were discussing previously. Below the total response time metrics, we have some very important refresh rate information that relates to the monitor and the test conditions that we're currently operating under. So of course, the refresh rate is very important for total response time behavior. So we're looking at 144 Hz for this particular monitor, and you'll see that on screen twice. The refresh window is effectively how long each frame is displayed on screen. So for a 144 Hz monitor, each frame is shown for 6.94 milliseconds. So every 6.94 milliseconds, the frame will be updated. And this is effectively a very simple calculation. We're just looking at 1000 divided by 144, which gives us the 6.94 milliseconds figure that we're looking at right there. Once we know our refresh window, we can calculate refresh compliance, which is pretty straightforward. What we're looking for is, in this response time heat map here, how many of these transitions take less than 6.94 milliseconds to occur. So you can see that many of these transitions are shorter than 6.94 milliseconds. Say these as an example, they're all 3.5, 3.4 milliseconds. However, there are some transitions that take longer than the 6.94 millisecond figure, and those are in that sort of corner there. So what we want to do is take a simple percentage. What percentage of response times transition less than the refresh rate window? That will become the refresh compliance number. So basically for this particular example, we would be excluding all of these transitions here and including all the other transitions, which gives us a refresh compliance of 93.6%. So 93.6% of all the transitions that we measured complete shorter than the refresh window. And this is important to note because at times when the monitor has a lot of transitions that take longer than this refresh window, we don't necessarily get the benefit of that additional refresh rate. You may see blur, ghosting, those sorts of things equivalent to lower refresh rates. Finally, let's talk about the cumulative deviation numbers, which is quite a unique measurement and something that isn't as intuitive to understand compared to the response time or the overshoot numbers. But essentially, the cumulative deviation numbers are a way for us to fully characterize the response behavior and summarize that in a single number. So we've often talked about cumulative deviation being a combination of our response time and peak overshoot values. We've also talked about cumulative deviation often showing the balance between response time and overshoot behavior, and you'll see that in the charts. For example, let's take a look at this section. You'll see that if we combine what we see for this area of performance for response times with this area of performance for overshoot values, we get fairly okay cumulative deviation values in sort of the light green region. That's because we have fast response times, low overshoot, which creates low cumulative deviation numbers. However, if we look in, say, this section, we have slower response times, no overshoot, but this creates weaker cumulative deviation numbers because effectively we're summing the results of the response times with the overshoot, and that creates these sort of weak cumulative deviation numbers. You'll see something similar for this top section. We've got relatively fast response times, however weaker overshoot behavior, and that creates middling to weak cumulative deviation numbers. Again, in this bottom section of the chart, we see similar. Very fast response times, but quite poor overshoot performance, and that leads to high cumulative deviation numbers. So the cumulative deviation numbers are indeed typically a balance of the response time and overshoot numbers and can combine both areas into a single number. But what is cumulative deviation? Well, let's take a look. So we're back here with our response time chart, and I've added this additional green line in here, which is illustrative of the ideal instant response time. As you can see, the transition effectively takes 0 time to complete, and that's what we want to see from monitors. We want to see those transitions happening as quickly as possible. Put simply, cumulative deviation is the difference between the response time we measure and the ideal instant response at every point along the transition curve. What this effectively creates is the area between the ideal response and the transition that we actually measure. So you can sort of think of cumulative deviation as an area. So for the transition in purple that we've got here, we're effectively again measuring the area between the green and the purple. So that looks something like this. We're sort of measuring all of this area in here and calling that the cumulative deviation value, because as we're going along, we're measuring the distance between what we're actually measuring and the ideal instant response for every point on the curve, and that gives us a nice area value. Similarly, if we were looking at the transition that has got overshoot, we're measuring the area between the response curve and the ideal instant response for all of this particular area here. And crucially, we're also including this overshoot section here because again, that's not ideal behavior. So we're wanting to measure the area in there as well as the area on this side of the curve. And what that creates is a measurement that includes not just how long the response time is taking, but also how long the overshoot's taking, how high the overshoot's taking. And what that does is it creates a measurement that factors in both the response times and the overshoot characteristics of a particular transition. There is of course some tolerance that we're using here as well. We are using a 3% tolerance above and below this particular line here. So anything that's included within this particular tolerance that we're showing there would not be included in the final cumulative deviation values. And that has all the benefits that we've been talking about previously in this video when it comes to tolerances. The benefits that cumulative deviation brings when it comes to response time transitions is that it measures more than just the response times. For example, previously, if we're looking at, say, the orange transition, we're measuring roughly here for the response time, and we're measuring roughly here for the overshoot. But there's many different areas to performance that we're not measuring. For example, we're not measuring how long the overshoot takes. We're not measuring how slow this part of the transition is or how fast this part of the transition is. Cumulative deviation factors in all those particular metrics. So if we had a transition that was pretty similar to the orange transition in terms of response time, but had much shorter overshoot characteristics, these would give two very similar metrics in our response time and overshoot numbers. We'd be measuring very similar response times here, and we'd be measuring very similar overshoot characteristics here. However, with our cumulative deviation metric, the area that we're measuring here for the orange curve would be quite different to the area that we're measuring for the blue curve, and the cumulative deviation metric would favor this shorter, sharper overshoot characteristic, which is sort of how you'd see it with your eyes. You're more likely to notice these inflated RGB values over a longer period of time, whereas this shorter value in blue, it's more likely to disappear from the screen shorter and therefore be more pleasing for your eyes. Similarly, we could have a transition which starts off a lot slower but quickly finishes towards the end. And if we were measuring the transition time using the metrics that we were talking about previously, the purple and the blue transitions would have very similar transition times. However, when it comes to cumulative deviation, this part in here, which is slower for the blue curve and therefore would probably look worse to your eyes, has a higher cumulative deviation value. So again, the easiest way to think of cumulative deviation as it's the area between the ideal response curve and the measured curve for both the initial response portion of the response time chart as well as the overshoot portion. And that gives us a whole range of metrics that easily summarizes the behavior of that particular transition. If you're interested in the actual way that this is calculated, for every single transition, we are taking discrete input values. So every time our sensor is taking a measurement, it's taking measurements that look something like this. It's a lot faster than this, obviously, but this is sort of just illustrating what's happening. And what we're doing is we're simply just measuring the distance between those two values for every single discrete value that we're taking along the curve. So whenever we take a value, we're just doing that simple comparison, and then we're adding all of those comparisons together, and that gives us our cumulative deviation value at the end. So again, the metrics that we're sort of providing there, the numbers, the units don't really matter too much because they're very much related to the testing tools that we're using, but the end values are very comparable from one monitor to the other. And that's ultimately what we're after. We want to make sure that we're measuring all the cumulative deviation values the same, and that gives us the comparison data to other monitors. So if we go back to our response time chart, you'll see here that these are where the cumulative deviation values lie. And like with all the other things that we've been talking about, there's still 110 transitions in this section, with cumulative deviation measured the exact same way for every single one of those metrics. You can see we've got the cumulative deviation for the rising transitions in the top right corner. And similarly, we've got the falling cumulative deviation for transitions in that bottom left corner. And all the metrics that you'll see in this section down here are very comparable to the same metrics over here. When we were talking about the average response, talking about average rise and fall, all of those are also equivalent for the cumulative deviation numbers. So the rise times are going to be this upper corner here, the fall times are going to be this bottom corner here, the best transition is going to be the lowest number, the worst transition is going to be the highest number, and the average dark level is going to be the transitions from 0 to 102 in that section. So once again, very similar to our response time measurements in terms of those averages, we're just taking a different measurement, the cumulative deviation measurement. So like I was saying at the start of this video, it's really the combination of these three metrics that gives us an overall picture of how a monitor performs. The response time numbers tell us about the initial transition. How quickly is that initial rise and how quickly does it reach the tolerance value? The overshoot numbers tell us how high is that peak if the monitor decides to overshoot for a particular transition, and then cumulative deviation sort of describes all of the characteristics of the display put together. And once you sort of get the hang of looking at the response time charts, the overshoot charts, and the cumulative deviation charts, you can kind of see how things go in terms of these responses. As we say, as I said earlier, some of the time you can sort of see the combination of the factors working together. Some of the times you can see that the cumulative deviation is related to a high overshoot, or the cumulative deviation might be related to slow initial response times, or whatever the case may be. With all these metrics at your fingertips, you should be able to get, like I said, very complete picture of the response time behavior. The final thing to note here is that for all of these heat map charts that we're using here, these are all grayscale RGB values. So when we're either looking at 26, 51, 77, those are all RGB 26, 26, 26, or RGB 51, 51, 51. And we use grayscale because generally speaking, there's not much of a difference comparing the response times of, say, reds versus blues versus greens. It doesn't make too much of a difference. So by testing grays, we keep it nice and consistent. All of the subpixels are illuminated, and that just gives us the best overall data that's very consistent between each monitor type. As well, there is some information down here that we haven't really described before. These are just the very basic settings that we're using for our response time measurements. So we've got the overdrive setting that we're using. We've got the display status. So this just lets you know that for every single display that we test, they're all calibrated before we're getting into the response time testing system, which means that for two monitors that may have different out-of-the-box performance in terms of its color accuracy, we're always calibrating the monitor to the same level of color accuracy so that each monitor is indeed performing the exact same transition. We don't want to have a case where we're testing one monitor and the 51 level is actually 53, and then for another monitor it's actually RGB 60 is the start value, and for another it might be RGB 58. We're ensuring via calibration that every monitor is actually starting from RGB 51 for that particular transition, and that helps us give more apples to apples data without a variable introduced. We've also got the gamma corrected factor there. We've talked a lot about gamma correction in this sort of summary of response time performance and some of the benefits of why we've used it. But again, there's that video available on Hardware Unboxed that will fully describe why we switched over our response time testing methodology from using more traditional response time metrics to these new gamma corrected metrics, which I feel are a bit more appropriate. And like I was sort of going through, every single number that you see here is from a gamma corrected number. So that includes the cumulative deviation numbers, the overshoot numbers, and the response time numbers. One final note I should make before jumping into the conclusion is that the way that we test response times is not necessarily the way that other reviewers test response times. One common thing that you'll see is that other reviewers may decide not to use gamma calibration and will be using more traditional metrics. You may see, for example, 10 to 90% transitions, which use a 10% tolerance. As I was talking about, I use 3 to 97% transitions with a 3% tolerance. These are some common areas where my numbers may differ to numbers from another reviewer because of those different decisions. And I have my reasons for why I test like this and why I think these numbers make the most sense for you as a viewer, but other reviewers may have different opinions and may be able to justify them in different ways. Another difference you may see is in these overshoot numbers. We use a percentage, but other reviewers may choose to use fixed RGB values or all sorts of different methods. Again, none of them are necessarily right or wrong. It's just making sure that for a particular reviewer, they're all testing in the exact same way, so the numbers they produce are comparable between their reviews. If you're trying to compare some of these numbers like response time numbers or overshoot numbers between me and another reviewer, you may see slightly different results simply because the methodology used is different. Alright, so that's it for our response time chart explanation. I know this has been requested heaps of times by some of our viewers on Hardware Unboxed, but this new monitors channel is all about this sort of content. We'll also be going through and explaining color charts and all sorts of other stuff in due course, so stay tuned for those videos if you're interested. And I do appreciate everyone that watched this video to the end, because I guess it shows that you're interested in learning about display content, so really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.